Dr. Evan Cole, a black heart surgeon, visits the small town of Millbrooke, only to become the target of blatant racism and systemic injustice. Wrongfully arrested by a racist officer, Evan uncovers a disturbing pattern of discrimination embedded in the town's institutions, from law enforcement to healthcare. As he faces relentless prejudice and abuse of power, Evan's fight for justice exposes the deep-seated corruption and biases that harm the community's most vulnerable. This gripping story highlights the infuriating realities of racism in America and the courage it takes to confront it head-on. Jackson Cole adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror, his face lit by the glow of a nearby streetlight. The diner across the street bustled with activity, a rare sight in the sleepy town of Millbrooke. He'd been here for hours, observing from the safety of his car. Inside the diner, his target laughed loudly, oblivious to the watchful eyes trained on him. Jackson took a deep breath, steadying himself. Tonight wasn't just another job, it was personal. Millbrooke's sheriff, Ted Grayson, sat at the counter, chatting casually with the waitress. Grayson was a man who knew how to wear his charm like a badge, but Jackson wasn't fooled. The man had a history, a trail of intimidation and backroom deals that led straight to the town's darkest corners. Jackson wasn't here for Grayson's charm, he was here for justice. In the corner of the diner, a door creaked open, and a figure stepped out. Jackson's pulse quickened. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. Dr. Evan Cole pulled his weathered sedan into the gravel parking lot of Millbrooke's only diner, its flickering neon sign casting a dim red glow over the small-town evening. He adjusted the sleeves of his plain button-up shirt, unconsciously brushing at an imaginary wrinkle. Evan's wardrobe, like the car he drove, spoke nothing of his stature as one of the nation's leading heart surgeons. It was by design. Millbrooke was a town where appearances mattered, where people preferred neat labels, easily understood roles. A man of Evan's accomplishments should, by those standards, have arrived in a luxury vehicle, wearing a tailored suit that screamed success. Instead, he blended into the understated surroundings, a habit forged by years of quietly breaking barriers. The town had changed little in the 2 decades since he last visited. The same uneven sidewalks framed the quiet streets, and the same brick storefronts stood stubbornly against time. But the idyllic surface belied a current of tension that Evan could feel as he stepped out of the car. The diner's door jingled as he entered, and the hum of conversation faltered for a moment. Heads turned briefly, eyes flicking over him, assessing, before returning to their coffee cups and sandwiches. It wasn't outright hostility, it never was, but there was a chill in the air that Evan had long since learned to ignore. He made his way to a booth in the corner, setting his medical bag gently on the seat beside him. The bag, plain black leather with well-worn handles, was the only hint of his profession. It had been his companion through surgeries that had saved hundreds of lives, a silent witness to triumphs and tragedies alike. The waitress approached with a notepad in hand, her smile polite but perfunctory. "Evening. What can I get you?" "Coffee, please," Evan replied, offering her a small, genuine smile. "Black." She nodded, scribbling the order without meeting his eyes. "Anything else?" "Not yet, thank you." As she walked away, Evan let his gaze drift around the room. The diner was a snapshot of small-town Americana. Vinyl booths, laminate tables, and a jukebox in the corner that looked like it hadn't worked in years. A young couple shared fries at the counter, their heads close together, while an older man in overalls nursed a mug of coffee, his gaze fixed on the local news playing on a muted TV. It was comfortable, unassuming, and utterly unremarkable. Yet Evan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Millbrooke had never been kind to outsiders, and Evan, despite his roots in the town, was no exception. As a black man who had risen to prominence in a field dominated by faces unlike his own, he had always been aware of the unspoken rules. Modesty and humility were his armor, ways to disarm the suspicion that followed him into spaces like this. Tonight was no different. Though he had no official reason to be in Millbrooke, Evan's presence was not without purpose. The whispers of corruption and systemic inequity that had plagued the town for years had grown louder. Patients he treated in the city hospital, some of whom hailed from Millbrooke, had hinted at practices that went beyond benign neglect. There were stories of people turned away from care, of resources disproportionately allocated, of lives undervalued. Evan had decided to see for himself, not as a surgeon, but as a concerned citizen, and, if necessary, as someone willing to disrupt the status quo. The waitress returned with his coffee, setting the mug down without a word. He thanked her, earning a faint nod before she moved on. Evan sipped the bitter brew, his mind turning over the stories he had heard, the faces of the patients who had shared them. The jingle of the door caught his attention, and Evan glanced up to see a man, in a sheriff's uniform, enter Sheriff Ted Grayson. The years had added gray to his temples, and a slight stoop to his once imposing frame, but the aura of authority remained intact. Grayson scanned the room, his eyes lingering briefly on Evan before he made his way to the counter. "Evening, Sheriff," the waitress greeted him warmly, setting a cup of coffee in front of him without being asked. Grayson grunted a reply, his gaze sliding back to Evan. It wasn't the first time their paths had crossed. Evan doubted Grayson remembered him, but he remembered the sheriff. As a teenager, Evan had been stopped and questioned by Grayson more times than he cared to count, always on flimsy pretenses. Grayson's scrutiny lingered a beat too long before he turned his attention to the waitress. "Quiet night?" She shrugged. "Same as always." "Good," Grayson said, sipping his coffee. "Let's keep it that way." Evan returned his focus to his cup, his calm exterior masking the unease that Grayson's presence stirred. The sheriff's reputation for maintaining order often skirted the line between diligence and intimidation. The sound of laughter from a nearby table drew Evan's gaze. A group of 3 men sat together, their conversation loud enough to carry across the diner. They were dressed in work boots and flannel, their hands rough and calloused. Mill workers, Evan guessed. One of them, a burly man with a thick beard, glanced in Evan's direction and leaned toward his companions, muttering something that drew chuckles. Evan caught fragments of their words. "Doesn't belong," and "fancy doctor," and felt the familiar prickle of tension. He kept his gaze steady, refusing to react, but the moment didn't go unnoticed. Grayson's eyes flicked toward the men, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Something funny?" Evan asked, his voice calm, but carrying enough weight to cut through the room's noise. The bearded man looked taken aback, his laugh faltering. "No harm meant," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Just making conversation." Evan didn't respond, his silence speaking volumes. The air in the diner grew heavier, the hum of conversation dimming as an unspoken tension settled over the room. Even the waitress seemed to sense it, her movements quick and deliberate as she avoided meeting anyone's gaze. Grayson stood, his hand resting on the counter as he addressed Evan. "Something bothering you, Doc?" Evan met the sheriff's gaze evenly. "Not at all, Sheriff." Grayson tilted his head slightly, his smirk returning. "Good to hear. We like to keep things peaceful around here." "Peaceful," Evan repeated, his tone neutral but loaded with meaning. For a moment, the 2 men stared at each other, a silent battle of wills. Then Grayson chuckled, a low sound that didn't reach his eyes, and returned to his coffee. Evan finished his coffee, leaving a few bills on the table before rising. He nodded politely to the waitress as he gathered his bag, his movements deliberate. As he stepped out into the cool night air, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. The tension of the diner still clung to him, but he pushed it aside. He had seen enough for one night. The gravel crunched beneath his shoes as he crossed the lot, his mind already planning his next steps. Millbrooke might have been content with its fragile peace, but Evan knew it wouldn't last. Not if he had anything to say about it. The headlights of an approaching car caught his attention, and he paused, his instincts sharpened by years of experience. The car slowed as it passed, its occupants peering out at him before driving on. Evan shook his head, his resolve hardening. He had returned to Millbrooke for answers, but it was clear he would have to uncover them the hard way. Evan had barely made it out of the parking lot when he spotted the familiar blue and white paint of a police cruiser idling by the side of the road. Its lights were off, but the unmistakable silhouette of a patrol car was enough to make his chest tighten. He told himself it was a coincidence Millbrooke was small, and it wasn't unusual to see a police presence in the area. Yet, as he turned onto the main road, the cruiser pulled out behind him. Its headlights flicked on, cutting through the dark as it followed him at a measured distance. Evan kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. He had been through this before. Too many times to count. A black man driving alone at night was all the reason some officers needed to stop him. He glanced at the rearview mirror, catching the faint outline of the driver. A minute later, the flashing red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. Evan sighed, easing his car to the side of the road. The gravel crunched beneath his tires as he came to a stop. He rolled down his window and rested his hands on the wheel, the gesture practiced and deliberate. The officer approached slowly, his hand resting near his holster. He was young, barely out of his 20s, with a clean-shaven face and a rigid posture that screamed inexperience. "Evening," the officer said, his tone curt. "License and registration, please." Evan nodded calmly. "Of course, my license is in my wallet, and my registration is in the glove compartment. May I reach for them?" The officer hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Evan. "Go ahead, slowly." Evan moved deliberately, retrieving his wallet and handing over his license before opening the glove compartment to pull out the registration. He could feel the officer's eyes on him the entire time, his body tense as though expecting trouble. "Is there a problem, officer?" Evan asked, keeping his tone neutral. "You didn't signal when you turned back there," the officer replied, his voice clipped. Evan blinked. He knew for a fact that he had signaled, he always did. "I see," he said simply, deciding not to argue. The officer glanced at the license, his brow furrowing as he read the name. "Dr. Evan Cole," he said, the words dripping with skepticism. "What brings you to Millbrooke, doctor?" "I'm visiting family," Evan lied smoothly. "Just passing through." The officer looked unconvinced, his gaze flicking between Evan and the license. "This is a quiet town, we don't usually see visitors at this hour." There it was, the unspoken implication, veiled just enough to maintain plausible deniability. Evan's grip on the wheel tightened for a brief moment before he forced himself to relax. "Well, officer, I'll be on my way soon," he said evenly. "Is there anything else you need from me?" The officer didn't respond immediately. He seemed to be debating whether to push further. Finally, he handed the license and registration back. "Sit tight," he said, walking back to his cruiser. Evan exhaled slowly, the familiar mix of frustration and resignation settling over him. He watched in the side mirror as the officer sat in his car, likely running his information. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. When the officer returned, his expression was unreadable. "Everything checks out," he said flatly. "Just make sure you use your signal next time." "Of course," Evan replied, his voice steady. "Thank you, officer." The officer hesitated again, as though expecting some kind of confrontation. When none came, he nodded stiffly and walked back to his cruiser. Evan waited until the patrol car had pulled away, before releasing a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He adjusted his rearview mirror, his jaw tight, as he started the car and drove away. The next morning, Evan decided to visit Millbrooke General Hospital, a modest building that looked more like a relic than a functioning medical facility. He had no official reason to be there, but he wanted to see how the hospital operated. The receptionist at the front desk greeted him with a perfunctory smile. She was a middle-aged woman with short graying hair and an air of impatience. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone making it clear she hoped the answer was no. "Yes, I'm Dr. Evan Cole," he said, extending a hand. "I was hoping to speak with the hospital administrator. Is that possible?" Her eyes flicked to his hand, but didn't take it. Instead, she gave him a tight smile. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I was hoping they might have a few minutes to spare," Evan replied. The receptionist's smile didn't waver, but there was a sharpness in her gaze. "I'll see if they're available," she said, her tone making it clear she didn't expect them to be. She disappeared into the back, leaving Evan to wait in the small, outdated lobby. The chairs were hard plastic, and the faint smell of antiseptic hung in the air. Minutes passed before the receptionist returned, her expression unreadable. "The administrator is busy," she said, "but Dr. Matthews can speak with you. Follow me." Evan followed her down a narrow hallway, his shoes squeaking against the linoleum. She led him to a small office where an older man with thinning hair and a perpetually furrowed brow sat behind a cluttered desk. "Dr. Cole," Matthews said, standing and extending a hand. His grip was firm but perfunctory. "What brings you to Millbrooke General?" "I'm visiting the area and wanted to learn more about the hospital," Evan said. "I've heard great things about your work here." Matthews chuckled, though there was no humor in it. Well, we do our best with what we have. Small-town hospitals aren't exactly flush with resources. Evan nodded, his gaze flicking to the framed photos and certificates on the wall. I understand. I've worked in similar environments before. Sometimes creativity is the best tool we have. Matthews leaned back in his chair, studying Evan. You're a surgeon, aren't you? Cardiology? Yes, Evan replied. Impressive, Matthews said, though his tone lacked genuine warmth. But I have to admit, we don't get many visiting surgeons just dropping by. What's the real reason you're here? Evan hesitated for a moment, then decided to be direct. I've heard concerns from some of your patients, issues with access to care, resource allocation. I wanted to see if there was any way I could help. Matthew's expression hardened slightly. I see. Well, Dr. Cole, I can assure you that we're doing everything we can for our patients. Small-town hospitals operate under different constraints than what you're probably used to in the city. I understand that, Evan said gently. But if there are systemic issues, they won't resolve themselves. Sometimes it takes a fresh perspective. Matthews bristled, his posture stiffening. We appreciate your concern, Doctor, but I think you'll find that Millbrooke General is perfectly capable of managing its affairs. The message was clear. Evan wasn't welcome. As Evan left the hospital, he couldn't shake the feeling that his visit had stirred something. The resistance he had encountered wasn't just about resources or pride. It was about protecting a system that had grown comfortable in its dysfunction. The tension in the town was palpable, and Evan knew it was only a matter of time before things came to a head. Evan's day had taken a sharp turn from uncomfortable to outright hostile. Word of his visit to Millbrooke General must have spread quickly. By the time he returned to the diner for lunch, the atmosphere was unmistakably charged. Conversations quieted as he entered, heads turned, and subtle glances were exchanged across the room. The waitress from the previous night avoided his gaze as she handed him a menu, her movements stiff and rehearsed. Evan wasn't hungry, but he ordered a sandwich and coffee to keep up appearances. As he waited, he pulled out his phone, scrolling through patient testimonials he'd collected over the years. Some from Millbrooke residents who had sought him out after being turned away locally. Each story added weight to his purpose, but it also reignited the simmering frustration he worked so hard to contain. These were real lives impacted by a system that thrived on exclusion and complacency. And here he was, sitting in a town where the cracks were not only visible, but intentionally ignored. His coffee arrived, steaming in the chipped white mug, but the sandwich never came. Instead, Officer Daniels walked in. Daniels had the swagger of a man who believed the badge on his chest gave him dominion over the world around him. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with a permanent smirk etched across his face, he was a symbol of the kind of unchecked power Evan had encountered before. He carried himself like he was in charge of more than just the town. He was in charge of its narrative. Daniels spotted Evan immediately, his smirk widening. Well, well, he drawled, loud enough for everyone in the diner to hear. If it isn't the city doctor, come to grace us with his presence. Evan stayed seated, meeting Daniels' gaze with quiet confidence. Afternoon, officer. Daniels ambled over, placing one hand on the back of the booth across from Evan, while the other rested casually on his holstered weapon. The gesture wasn't lost on Evan, and judging by the diner's sudden silence, it wasn't lost on anyone else either. You know, we don't get many visitors around here, Daniels said, leaning in slightly. Especially ones who take such an interest in our little hospital. I'm interested in people, Evan replied calmly. Millbrooke is no exception. Daniels chuckled, though there was no humor in it. People, huh? Well, Doc, people around here like to keep things simple. They don't take kindly to outsiders poking around where they don't belong. Evan took a measured sip of his coffee. I wasn't aware that healthcare counted as poking around, but if it does, then maybe that's part of the problem. The smirk faded from Daniel's face, replaced by something colder, more calculated. He straightened, stepping back just enough to draw attention to the tension in the room. The other diners sat frozen, their gazes darting between Evan and the officer. You watch yourself, Cole, Daniel said, his voice dropping. I'd hate for you to get the wrong impression of Millbrooke. We're good people here. Good people don't need to threaten others to prove it, Evan replied, his tone even but firm. Daniel's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the diner door jingled again, and another figure entered. Mitchell Hart, the town's only defense attorney, was an unassuming man with glasses perpetually sliding down his nose and a demeanor that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. But there was a sharpness in his eyes that betrayed his otherwise timid appearance. "Afternoon, Officer Daniels," Mitchell said, his tone carefully neutral as he approached. "Dr. Cole." He nodded politely to Evan, before turning back to Daniels. "I hope everything's all right here." Daniels didn't respond immediately. His eyes flicked to Mitchell, then back to Evan. "Everything's fine, Mitchell, just having a friendly chat." Mitchell smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Good to hear. I'm sure we all want to keep things friendly." Daniels lingered a moment longer, his hand still resting on his holster. Finally, he took a step back. "You have a good day, Doc," he said, his smirk returning. "And don't overstay your welcome." Evan waited until Daniels was gone, before releasing a slow breath. The tension in the room didn't dissipate entirely, but it eased enough for the hum of conversation to resume. Mitchell slid into the booth across from Evan, his expression apologetic. "I'd say welcome to Millbrooke, but I'm guessing that wouldn't feel entirely accurate." "Not entirely," Evan agreed, offering a faint smile. "Thanks for stepping in." Mitchell waved it off. "Daniels is a fixture around here, and not a particularly pleasant one. I've had my share of run-ins with him." Evan leaned back in his seat, studying the attorney. "Why stay?" Mitchell shrugged, his gaze dropping to the table. "Because someone has to." Later that evening, Evan found himself in the hospital parking lot, staring at the empty rows of cars under dim, flickering lights. He had stayed later than he intended, poring over patient records that had mysteriously appeared on his desk during a brief meeting with a sympathetic nurse. The files painted a damning picture: discrepancies in treatment protocols, inexplicable gaps in care, and decisions that seemed to favor some patients over others, without medical justification. He was so engrossed in his thoughts that he didn't hear the footsteps until it was too late. "Evening, Doc." Evan turned to find Daniels and another officer, a wiry man with sharp features and a nervous energy, blocking his path to his car. Daniels' smirk was firmly in place, but there was a new edge to it, a dangerous glint in his eyes that made the hair on Evan's neck stand on end. "Long day at the hospital?" Daniels asked, his tone mocking. "Seems like you're taking quite an interest in our little town." "I'm a doctor," Evan said evenly. "It's what I do." Daniels chuckled, shaking his head. "See, that's the thing. What you're doing doesn't look like doctoring to me, looks more like snooping." The other officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Daniels and Evan. "Maybe we should just—" "Quiet," Daniels snapped, cutting him off. His gaze remained fixed on Evan. "I think it's time we had a little talk." Evan's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice calm. "I don't think that's necessary." "Oh, but it is," Daniels said, stepping closer. "See? You've been asking a lot of questions, poking around where you don't belong, and that makes people nervous." "I'm not here to make anyone nervous," Evan replied. "I'm here to help." Daniels's smirk twisted into something darker. "Help? Let me tell you something, Doc. People like you don't come to Millbrooke to help. They come to stir up trouble, and trouble's the last thing this town needs." Evan clenched his jaw, his composure slipping ever so slightly. "People like me care to elaborate?" Daniel's smirk widened. "Oh, you know exactly what I mean." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Evan's heart pounded, his mind racing through possible responses. He could stand his ground, call out the blatant prejudice for what it was. But he knew where that would lead. Daniels wasn't looking for a conversation, he was looking for control. "I think we're done here," Evan said, his voice steady. But Daniels wasn't finished. He stepped closer, his hand moving to his holster. "Not until I say so." The tension was suffocating, the parking lot silent, except for the faint hum of the hospital's exterior lights. Evan could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, every instinct telling him to walk away. But Daniels wasn't going to let him. The other officer cleared his throat nervously. "Daniels, maybe we should—" "Stay out of this!" Daniels barked, his focus never wavering from Evan. Evan's hand stayed at his sides, his gaze steady. "If you're going to arrest me, then do it. Otherwise, I suggest you step aside." Daniels froze, his smirk faltering for just a moment. Then, with a sneer, he reached for his cuffs. "You just don't know when to keep quiet, do you, Doc?" The sound of the cuffs snapping open echoed in the parking lot. Evan's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. This wasn't the first time he'd been here, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Evan Cole stood in the hospital parking lot, the cold night air cutting through his thin jacket as Officer Daniels tightened the handcuffs around his wrists. The sharp metallic click of the cuffs echoed in the empty lot, final and unyielding. "You're under arrest," Daniels said, his voice dripping with mock authority. "Suspicious activity, obstructing a public officer, and I'll think of something else by the time we get to the station." The other officer, a younger man Evan hadn't caught the name of, shifted uncomfortably beside Daniels. His eyes darted toward Evan, then back to his superior. "Daniels, this seems—" "Quiet, Stevens," Daniels barked, his tone sharp. "I've got this under control." Evan's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. He refused to let Daniels see the frustration boiling beneath his calm exterior. "You're making a mistake," he said evenly, his voice cutting through the tension. Daniels leaned closer, his smirk widening. "The only mistake here is you thinking you can waltz into my town and start stirring up trouble. We don't need city types like you coming in and pretending they know how to fix things." Evan met his gaze, unflinching. "What you're doing isn't about the law, it's about power, and it's not going to work." Daniel's smirk faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. "We'll see about that." The ride to the station was silent, save for the faint crackle of the radio in Daniel's cruiser. Evan sat in the back, his hands cuffed and resting on his lap, his mind racing. He had prepared for moments like this, mentally, emotionally, but it never got easier. Through the window, the quiet streets of Millbrooke passed in a blur. The town was asleep, unaware of the small storm brewing in its shadow. Evan's gaze lingered on the flickering streetlights, the worn storefronts, the faces of a few late-night wanderers who glanced at the cruiser as it rolled by. The other officer, Stevens, drove with a tense grip on the wheel. Evan could see his discomfort in the way his shoulders hunched, the way his eyes flicked nervously between the road and the rearview mirror. "Daniels," Stevens said finally, breaking the silence. "This doesn't feel right." Daniels shot him a withering look. "Are you questioning me?" "No," Stevens said quickly, his voice shaking. "I'm just saying, he's a doctor, he hasn't done anything." "That's enough," Daniels snapped. "You let me worry about what feels right." Evan's voice was calm, but deliberate. "You don't have to do this, Officer Stevens. You know this is wrong." Stevens' knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, but he didn't respond. The Millbrooke police station was a relic of another era, its worn bricks and peeling paint a testament to the town's unwillingness to change. Daniels marched Evan inside, his grip firm on the cuffs, as though to display his control to the few officers still on duty. A desk sergeant looked up from her paperwork, her brow furrowing as she took in the scene. "Daniels?" she said, her tone cautious. "What's going on?" "Brought in a suspect," Daniels replied smoothly. "Suspicious behavior, we'll process him here." The sergeant's eyes flicked to Evan, and for a moment, something like recognition crossed her face. "Isn't this—" "Doesn't matter who he is," Daniels interrupted, his tone sharp. "He was poking around where he doesn't belong." Evan stayed silent, his gaze steady as Daniels led him to a holding cell. The metal door clanged shut behind him, the sound reverberating in the small space. Evan wasn't alone for long. Less than an hour later, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the station, followed by the unmistakable voice of Mitchell Hart. "What the hell is this, Daniels?" Mitchell demanded, his voice carrying through the building. Daniels appeared in the doorway, his smirk firmly in place. "Hart, you're out late. Something keeping you up?" "Yeah," Mitchell shot back, stepping closer. "You hauling in an innocent man on bogus charges. Care to explain that?" Daniels shrugged, leaning against the doorframe. "Just doing my job. Dr. Cole here was acting suspicious. Thought it best to bring him in." "Suspicious," Mitchell repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "The man's a heart surgeon, for God's sake. What exactly was he doing that seemed so suspicious to you?" Daniel's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "That's for me to determine." Mitchell didn't back down. "No, it's not. You've overstepped, Daniels. And you're not dragging me or this town into whatever mess you're trying to create." Before Daniels could respond, the station's front doors burst open, and another figure entered. a woman in her 40s with sharp features and an air of authority that commanded attention. "Daniels," she said, her tone icy. "What the hell is going on here?" Daniels stiffened, the smirk finally vanishing from his face. "Chief," he stammered, "I—" The woman, Chief Harper, held up a hand to silence him. "Save it. I just got a call from the hospital administrator. Do you have any idea who you've arrested?" Daniels opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Harper turned her gaze to Evan, her expression softening slightly. "Dr. Cole, I'm sorry for this misunderstanding. You'll be released immediately." Daniels bristled. "Chief, I was just—" "You were just making a fool of yourself in this department," Harper snapped. "You have no grounds for this arrest. None, and now I have to clean up your mess." Evan stood as the cell door swung open, his movements calm but deliberate. "Thank you, Chief Harper," he said quietly. "But this isn't just about me, it's about the people in this town who face the same treatment every day." Harper hesitated, her gaze flicking to Daniels, then back to Evan. "You're right," she admitted, "and it's long past time we did something about it." As Evan stepped out of the station, Mitchell at his side, he glanced back at the building. The confrontation with Daniels was far from over. The files he'd seen, the stories he'd heard, everything pointed to a deeper rot in Millbrooke's institutions, and Daniels was just a symptom of the disease. "Evan," Mitchell said, his voice low, "what are you planning to do?" Evan's gaze hardened, his resolve solidifying. "I'm going to shine a light on this town," he said, "and I'm not stopping until every shadow is exposed." The quiet determination in his voice was unshakable. The battle had just begun. The Millbrooke town hall was crowded, the room buzzing with murmurs as residents filed in, curious about the sudden meeting called by Chief Harper. Evan stood near the front, his posture calm but his mind sharp, scanning the faces in the room. He wasn't here to make friends, he was here to force a reckoning. At the back of the room, Officer Daniels leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, and his smirk firmly in place. He caught Evan's eye and gave a small mocking wave, as if to say, "You won't win this." Evan turned back to the front, as Chief Harper stepped to the podium, her expression unreadable. She cleared her throat, and the murmurs subsided. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began. "Tonight, we'll be addressing some concerns raised about practices within this town's institutions." Evan didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped forward, his voice carrying through the room. "These concerns aren't just about practices, Chief. They're about people, real lives that are being impacted by systemic neglect and outright prejudice." The room went silent, all eyes on Evan. He met their gazes one by one, letting the weight of his words settle. "I've been in Millbrooke for only a few days, but in that time, I've seen enough to know this town has a problem that starts at the top." Daniels pushed off the wall, his smirk widening as he sauntered to the front of the room. "You've got a lot of nerve, Doc," he said, his tone mocking. "Coming into my town and throwing around accusations like that." Evan turned to face him, his expression calm but resolute. "Your town, Officer Daniels? Or is it the people's town? Because from where I'm standing, it seems like you've forgotten who you're supposed to serve." The crowd murmured, shifting uncomfortably. Daniels's smirk faltered for a split second before he regained his composure. "You don't know a damn thing about this town," he snapped. "Or about me." Evan took a step closer, his voice steady and deliberate. "I know enough. I know you use your badge to intimidate and control. I know you arrested me without cause, fabricated charges, and ignored every protocol because you thought you could get away with it." Daniel's face darkened, his hands curling into fists. "You think you're better than us? That you can waltz in here and tell us how to do our jobs?" "This isn't about being better," Evan shot back. "It's about accountability, about making sure people like you can't abuse the power you've been given." The room erupted into whispers, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Chief Harper stepped forward, raising a hand to quiet the crowd. "That's enough," she said sharply, her gaze flicking between Evan and Daniels. "We're here to address facts, not trade insults." Evan reached into his bag, pulling out the stack of files he had collected from the hospital. "These are the facts," he said, holding them up. "Patient records that show a pattern of neglect, discrimination, and favoritism. And it doesn't stop at the hospital. It's woven into the fabric of this town, from law enforcement to public services. People are suffering, and it's being swept under the rug. Daniels scoffed, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. That's a lot of big talk, Doc, but where's your proof? You've got some papers, sure, but that doesn't mean anything. Evan turned to the crowd. The proof isn't just in these files, it's in the stories of the people who live here. People who've been turned away from care, harassed, and made to feel like second-class citizens in their own town. A voice from the back of the room rang out. He's right. All eyes turned as an older black woman stood, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a cane. My grandson, she said, her voice wavering but strong. He broke his arm last year, and the hospital said they couldn't treat him, sent us to the next town over, but when my neighbor's son got hurt, they patched him up right there. Another voice joined in. I've been stopped by Daniels 3 times this month. Each time, he made up some excuse, but I knew it was because I didn't fit his idea of who should be here. The room erupted, voices rising as more people began sharing their stories. Daniel's face went pale. His smirk, long gone. He glanced at Chief Harper, but she was silent, her expression unreadable. Evan raised a hand, quieting the crowd. This isn't just about Officer Daniels or the hospital, it's about all of us, about whether we're willing to accept this as the norm or stand up and demand better. Daniels stepped forward, his voice rising above the noise. You think you're some kind of hero, Cole? You don't know what it takes to keep this town running. You don't know the sacrifices we make. Evan met his gaze, his voice calm, but cutting. Sacrifices. Is that what you call profiling innocent people, denying care to those in need, and protecting a system that's broken? That's not sacrifice, Daniels. That's cowardice. Daniels snapped. You don't belong here. You don't know anything about us, and you never will. The words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. The room fell silent, the weight of Daniel's outburst settling over the crowd. For the first time, the mask had slipped, revealing the depths of his prejudice. Evan took a step closer, his voice steady and unwavering. You're right about one thing, Daniels. I don't belong here, but neither do your lies, your intimidation, or your abuse of power. And I'm not leaving until something changes. The crowd murmured in agreement, the tide shifting as people began to rally behind Evan. Chief Harper stepped forward, her jaw set. Daniels, she said, her voice cold, you're done. Daniels whirled on her, his eyes wide. You can't be serious. I've served this town for... You've served yourself, Harper interrupted. And now it's over. Turn in your badge and gun effective immediately. The room erupted in gasps and whispers as Daniels stood frozen, his face a mask of shock and fury. Finally, he turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. As the crowd began to disperse, Evan stood at the front of the room, his shoulders squared and his gaze steady. Mitchell approached, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You did it, he said. Evan shook his head. This is just the beginning. The system doesn't change overnight. Mitchell nodded, his expression thoughtful. So what's next? Evan's gaze shifted to the stack of files in his hands, the weight of them a reminder of the work still to be done. We keep going one step at a time. Outside, the cold night air greeted him as he stepped into the parking lot. The shadows seemed less oppressive now, the weight of the confrontation lifting slightly. But Evan knew the battle was far from over. In the distance, a figure watched from the shadows, their presence unnoticed by the others. As Evan reached his car, the figure stepped back into the darkness, their movements deliberate. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. The cold fluorescent lights of the Millbrooke town hall flickered above the tense crowd, their faces a mix of apprehension and curiosity. The room was packed, buzzing with murmured conversations as residents filled every seat and lined the walls. Word had spread quickly about the emergency meeting called by Chief Harper. Most of the town knew it had something to do with the high-profile arrest of Dr. Evan Cole, a situation that had become the talk of the town. Evan stood at the front of the room, his calm demeanor concealing the storm brewing inside him. His wrists still bore faint red marks from the handcuffs Daniels had so proudly fastened the night before. The files he had collected sat in a neat stack on the table beside him, damning evidence of a system riddled with corruption and neglect. At the back of the room, Officer Daniels leaned casually against the wall, his arms crossed and his trademark smirk firmly in place. He wasn't here to explain himself or admit fault. He was here to assert dominance, to make it clear to everyone, especially Evan, that he was untouchable. Chief Harper stepped to the podium, her presence commanding enough to silence the murmurs. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming on such short notice. We're here to address some serious allegations concerning conduct within our town's institutions." Her voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of tension as she glanced toward Daniels, then to Evan. "Dr. Cole, you've requested to speak first. The floor is yours." Evan nodded and stepped forward, his movements deliberate. He scanned the room, meeting the eyes of the townsfolk who had gathered. Some looked curious, others skeptical, and a few openly hostile, but there were also glimmers of support, subtle but present. "Thank you, Chief Harper," Evan began, his voice calm but firm. "I came to Millbrooke for a simple reason: to understand why so many people from this town have been denied the care they need and deserve. What I found is far worse than I expected." He gestured to the stack of files. "These are patient records from Millbrooke General Hospital. They show a pattern, a deliberate one, of discrimination in treatment. People turned away for reasons that have nothing to do with medical necessity. Resources allocated based on who you are, not what you need." The crowd murmured, the tension in the room thickening. "And it doesn't stop at the hospital," Evan continued. "This town's institutions, law enforcement included, operate on the same principle. Certain people are protected, others are targeted." Daniels straightened, his smirk tightening into a thin line. "You've got a lot of nerve, Doc," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Coming into my town and accusing us of what racism, corruption. You don't know anything about Millbrooke." Evan turned to face him, his gaze steady. "I know what I've seen, Officer Daniels. I know that when I was sitting in my car, doing nothing wrong, you arrested me without cause. I know you've stopped and harassed people in this town for no reason other than the color of their skin." The room erupted in whispers, the crowd shifting uneasily. Daniels pushed off the wall, walking toward the front of the room. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he said, his voice rising. "You're nothing but an outsider sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. You don't understand how things work here." "You're right," Evan replied, his tone sharp. "I don't understand how a town can justify protecting people like you while letting its own residents suffer. But I do know this: you're not untouchable." Evan reached for the files, pulling out a single sheet of paper. "This," he said, holding it up, "is a record of a patient who died waiting for care they should have received right here in Millbrooke. Their case was deprioritized because resources were allocated to someone deemed more deserving. And that decision was made based on race." Gasps rippled through the room. "And here," Evan continued, pulling out another sheet, "is a sworn statement from a hospital employee who says they were pressured by law enforcement to overlook certain cases while prioritizing others. That officer was you, Daniels." Daniels' face darkened, his smirk disappearing entirely. "That's a lie," he spat. "You have no proof." "I have their statement," Evan countered, "and I'm willing to bet they're not the only one." Chief Harper stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "Daniels," she said, her voice cold, "is this true?" Daniels hesitated, his jaw tightening. Then, with a sneer, he turned to the crowd. "You're really going to take his word over mine, over someone who's been protecting this town for years?" "Protecting?" Evan shot back. "Or controlling? You use fear to keep people in line, Daniels, but that ends tonight." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, voices rising in anger and disbelief. Daniels looked around, his bravado cracking as the tide began to turn against him. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped, his voice tinged with desperation. "Everything I've done has been for this town, for its safety." Evan took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "Safety isn't built on fear, it's built on trust, and you've betrayed that trust." At that moment, the door at the back of the room opened, and a young woman stepped inside. She was nervous, her hands clutching a folder tightly to her chest. All eyes turned to her as she made her way to the front. "My name is Claire Stevens," she said, her voice trembling, but resolute. "I'm a nurse at Millbrooke General, and I can confirm everything Dr. Cole is saying." Daniel's face turned ashen. You don't know what you're talking about, he barked. Yes, I do, Claire shot back, her voice growing stronger. I've seen you pressure staff to change patient priorities, I've seen the charts, and I'm not going to stay silent anymore. Chief Harper turned to Daniels, her expression hard. Is this true? Daniels opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time, he looked small, his authority crumbling around him. Evan stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos. This isn't just about Daniels, it's about a system that allowed this to happen, a system that needs to change. The room erupted in applause and shouts of agreement. The energy-electric Daniels stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides, before finally turning and storming out of the room. As the crowd began to disperse, Evan stayed behind, watching as Chief Harper approached. You've shaken things up, she said, her voice low. But this isn't over. I know, Evan replied. This is just the beginning. Outside, the night was still, but the weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air. Evan knew the fight wasn't over. The system didn't change overnight. But for the first time, the cracks were showing. And that was enough to give him hope. The following morning, the town of Millbrooke was buzzing. News of the meeting had spread like wildfire, and the cracks in the carefully maintained facade of its institutions were impossible to ignore. Officer Daniels had fled the room the previous night, his authority and reputation crumbling under the weight of the revelations. By dawn, Chief Harper had issued a public statement confirming that Daniels had been suspended pending a full investigation. Evan watched the sunrise from his modest motel room, the faint light casting long shadows on the walls. He should have felt a sense of triumph. After all, the confrontation had shifted the balance of power in the town. But the weight of what lay ahead tempered his satisfaction. One man's fall was a start, but it wasn't the end of the fight. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. When he opened it, Mitchell stood there, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. Thought you might need this, Mitchell said, handing one over. Evan took it with a nod of thanks. How's the town holding up? Divided, Mitchell admitted, leaning against the doorframe. Plenty of people are furious with Daniels, but there are still those who think he was just doing his job. Evan sipped his coffee, the bitterness grounding him. That's how these things go. Change doesn't happen overnight. No, Mitchell agreed, his voice thoughtful. But you've started something people are talking in ways they weren't before. Later that day, Evan met Chief Harper at the station. The mood was tense, the air thick with unspoken questions. Harper led him into her office, closing the door behind them. Daniels has turned in his badge, she said without preamble, settling into her chair. He's claiming he was forced out unfairly, but with the evidence you and Nurse Stevens provided, there's no way he can dodge accountability. Evan nodded. And the hospital? Harper sighed, rubbing her temples. That's a tougher fight. The administration is denying any wrongdoing, but the board is meeting next week to address the concerns. Your files gave us leverage, but it's going to take time to root out the issues. Evan leaned forward, his voice firm. Time is something the people in this town don't have. Lives are at stake, Chief. This can't get buried in bureaucracy. Harper met his gaze, her expression resolute. I'll do what I can. You have my word. Over the next few days, the ripple effects of the confrontation became increasingly visible. Daniel's absence left a noticeable gap in the police department, and several officers began speaking out about the toxic culture he had fostered. Nurse Stevens and other hospital staff came forward with additional accounts of misconduct, forcing the board to take immediate action. Evan became a reluctant figurehead for the growing movement. People stopped him on the street to thank him, share their stories, or ask for advice. It was overwhelming at times, but it also reinforced why he had come to Millbrooke in the first place. Mitchell, ever the pragmatist, stepped in to help organize the community's efforts. Together, they held town meetings, providing a platform for residents to voice their concerns and demand change. I've never seen people this engaged, Mitchell said one evening after a particularly spirited meeting. You've given them hope, Evan. Evan shook his head. It's not about me, it's about them realizing they deserve better, and that they have the power to demand it. The experience had left its mark on Evan. He had always been aware of the challenges that came with fighting for justice, but Millbrooke had reminded him of the importance of resilience and adaptability. For years, He had focused on his work in the operating room, believing that saving lives one by one was enough. But this fight had shown him that systemic change required stepping outside his comfort zone and confronting the broader forces at play. As he packed his bag in preparation to leave Millbrooke, Evan paused to look at himself in the mirror. The faint lines on his face seemed deeper, the shadows under his eyes more pronounced. But there was also a sense of clarity, a recognition of the path he had chosen and the challenges that lay ahead. On his way out of town, Evan stopped by the diner where his journey had begun. The atmosphere was lighter now, the tension from his first visit replaced with an air of cautious optimism. The waitress from that night approached his table, her smile shy but genuine. "Thank you," she said simply, setting down his coffee. "For what?" Evan asked. "For standing up," she replied. "For showing us we didn't have to stay quiet." Evan nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. "The real work starts now. Don't let anyone convince you it's over." As he left the diner, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the town. The road stretched out before him, a reminder that the fight for justice was ongoing, but for the first time in a long while, Evan felt hopeful, not just for Millbrooke, but for the countless towns like it across the country. As Evan's car disappeared down the road, Chief Harper stood on the steps of the station, watching him go. She held a folder in her hand, its contents detailing the systemic issues uncovered during the investigation. "Where do we go from here?" Mitchell asked, stepping up beside her. Harper's gaze was steady. "We rebuild, and we make damn sure this doesn't happen again." In the distance, the faint wail of a siren broke the evening quiet, a reminder of the work still to be done. As Evan Cole drove away from Millbrooke, he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, mingled with an even quieter unease. He had come to the town on a quest for understanding, a chance to connect dots between the whispers of inequality he'd heard from his patients and the systemic barriers he suspected were at play. What he found was a microcosm of a larger, more insidious problem, one that stretched far beyond the town's borders. In the week he spent there, Evan had faced open hostility, veiled threats, and blatant injustice. Yet, he had also witnessed something extraordinary: courage in the face of adversity. The nurse who risked her career to come forward, the townspeople who began sharing their stories, and the quiet shift in attitudes that hinted at the possibility of change. These were the embers of progress, small but undeniable. For Evan, the experience was transformative. As a surgeon, he had always believed in precision and control, in the power of saving lives one by one. But Millbrooke had shown him that the most profound changes required stepping outside the operating room, engaging with the world in ways that felt messy and uncomfortable. It was a lesson he would carry with him, a reminder that healing wasn't just about the body, but about the systems that shaped people's lives. The events in Millbrooke were not unique, and that was both the tragedy and the call to action. The town was a mirror, reflecting the systemic racism, abuse of power, and inequities that permeated countless communities across the country. Daniels was not an anomaly. He was a product of a system that rewarded complacency and discouraged accountability. The hospital's discriminatory practices were not isolated. They were symptoms of a healthcare system that often failed its most vulnerable. But Millbrooke was also a testament to the power of individuals to challenge that system. Change, as Evan had learned, started with one voice, one action, one refusal to accept the status quo. It was messy, slow, and often painful. But it was also inevitable when enough people decided they had had enough. The movement Evan sparked in Millbrooke was a small one, but it mattered. Residents who had long stayed silent began to speak out. The hospital administration, under scrutiny from both the community and external regulators, faced mounting pressure to reform. And while Daniels's resignation didn't undo the harm he had caused, it sent a message. Unchecked power could no longer hide behind a badge. The story of Millbrooke is a reminder that change is possible, even in the face of deeply entrenched systems. It starts with individuals who are willing to stand up, speak out, and demand better. It requires courage, resilience, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, not just in others, but in ourselves. Evan's journey was not about heroism, it was about responsibility. He didn't set out to be a savior, and he wasn't. What he did was simpler and in many ways more powerful. He refused to look away. He listened, he acted, and he stood firm when it mattered most. His story is a call to all of us to do the same, to recognize that we have a role to play in shaping the kind of world we want to live in. The people of Millbrooke remind us that collective action is the engine of change. When individuals come together, their voices amplify, their courage multiplies, and their impact deepens. Progress is never perfect, and it is rarely linear, but it is always worth fighting for. As Evan left Millbrooke behind, he knew the fight was far from over. The road ahead was long, and the forces of resistance would not fade quietly. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just a surgeon anymore. He was an advocate, a disruptor, and a witness to the power of human resilience. He thought of Claire Stevens, the young nurse who had risked everything to stand up for what was right. He thought of Mitchell, whose quiet persistence had been the steady hand guiding the town toward progress. He thought of the countless residents who had found their voices, transforming their pain into a force for change. And he thought of himself, not as a hero, but as a man who had chosen to step into the fray, knowing it was the only way forward. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. As Evan drove into the growing darkness, he felt a sense of hope. Not just for Millbrooke, but for every town like it, every community grappling with the weight of injustice. The fight wasn't over, but the spark had been lit, and that was enough to keep him moving.